Welcome back to Core CSS Mastery. We're going to be talking about box shadows. We looked very briefly at a similar property earlier in the course. It was the text shadow property, and it allowed us to add a shadow to text. Box shadow is very similar to text shadow, but it adds a shadow to the entire element rather than the text itself. We're going to see how this works by making use of a heading. And just to illustrate where the box or the total space that the element takes up, let's start by adding a border to this h1 tag. So we'll start h1 and we'll set a border to solid 1 pixel black. And we can see at the moment it's taking up the full width of the viewport. So let's set the width to 160 pixels. Let's also set a border radius to 25 pixels to get a nice curved effect on the edge there. And now it just looks like we need a bit of padding on that. So let's set the padding to 5 pixels. And if anything, it probably needs more padding horizontally, but less padding vertically. So let's just set a 1 pixel on the vertical, but we'll set a 5 pixel on the horizontal. Looks fine. Let's make it 10 pixels for horizontal padding. Okay, great. There's a heading. Now we're going to add a box shadow. The box shadow property, we can start off with a basic box shadow where we'll supply 3 values. We're going to supply the X or horizontal offset in pixels. So let's set that to 3 pixels. We're going to supply the Y or vertical offset. Again, we'll set that to 3 pixels. And we're going to provide a color. Let's use dark blue for this. So we can see we have a basic shadow on our element. It doesn't look very much like a shadow just yet because it's basically solid color, and that's not really how shadows work. We'll come back to that a bit later. For now, we're just going to play around with these offset values. So if I were to set the horizontal offset to a negative value, watch what happens to the shadow. Jumps over to the left-hand side. And if I were to change the vertical offset to a negative value, it now appears at the top of the element. So we can set this shadow to be as large as we like, both horizontally and vertically. For example, if I set this to 10 pixels, now we have a really deep looking shadow. Comes out a lot at the bottom, but not so much horizontally. Now let's leave it at 3 pixels, 3 pixels. And we can make it look a bit more like a shadow by setting the blur radius, which is a third sizing we can provide. And the larger this value, the more of a shadow effect we get. And the larger the value, the more washed out the shadow will appear. So if we set this to 3 pixels, have a look at the shadow. See, that's much more of a blurred shadow right now. Let's give it some larger values. Notice the effect. This is extremely blurred now. And as you can imagine, the larger this value gets, the wider the shadow spreads out, but the more blurred it is. So there's lots of different effects we can create here using box shadow. We just wanted a traditional shadow effect. We'll set that to something quite small. And you can see we kind of have a bit of a 3D effect here on the element. As you can imagine, if we were styling this for real, we'd probably add some colors to the heading itself. Let's try light blue here on the border. And also we could set a color on the font itself. Set that to light blue as well. That looks a bit too washed out. Let's try a blue color. Now there's actually a 4th sizing we can apply, and that's referred to as the spread radius, which is going to control the size of the shadow itself. So if I were to set 10 pixels for that, we're going to get a very large shadow. As you can see, this probably isn't the effect that we were looking for. But one potential application of this is if we wanted an even shadow surrounding the entire element. So for example, we could actually set these values to 0 pixels. But the shadow is going to be so large that it's now going to surround the element evenly. And if we also increase the blur radius, so the shadow is not so thick, now we get an effect around the element that we might actually think about using. It's like a colored background for the element. Generally, the way I like to use box shadow, however, is to create a 3D effect on the element. So I won't necessarily be making use of the spread radius as much. Mostly just the blur radius to create a nice 3D effect. And it's going to work slightly better with fairly low values. So you can see we kind of get the impression that the element is raised slightly off the page here. This works really nicely for buttons as well, which we'll get to a bit later in the course. The idea is we can set this up so But when we click on the button, we want to give the impression that the button is being depressed. So we just remove the box shadow. I'll give you a quick taste of how that might work. If we were to style a H1 with the pseudo class hover, we could now set this to box shadow none. So notice what happens when we hover our cursor over the heading. It's like the heading's slightly raised up. When we hover our cursor over the heading, the box shadow disappears and it gives an animation effect where it looks like the button or heading is being depressed. Now, we wouldn't use this for a heading, but it's just to illustrate what can be achieved with box shadow. We can also supply an inset value to box shadow, and this controls whether the shadow is outside of the element or inside of the element. So notice here, if I have the inset property, it actually gives the opposite effect. So without inset, it's almost as if the element is being raised off the page, and that's why it creates a shadow effect. So here we can see the shadow is to the right and to the bottom, so it creates the effect that there's a light source coming from the top left and creating that shadow at the bottom right. However, if we provide the inset value, it gives the opposite effect. Rather than the button being raised off the page, it gives the impression that the button is sunk into the page and it's actually slightly lower than the level of the page itself. If we wanted to see that effect in motion, once again, we could set a hover pseudo class here on the H1. Just copy and paste this over and we'll get rid of the inset. So when we hover, the button is now 3D. When we let go, we can see the button is actually sunk into the page. So this is just a regular button. It looks like it's on the page. There's no 3D effect right now. And if we hover, let's set it so when we hover, it's sunk into the page with inset. So when we hover, it's almost as if that button is being depressed down into the page. We get this sunken effect. So making use of both 3D raised up effects and sunken effects can have a nice effect on a page. It can make a 2D page look like it's 3D. Now, just to see what the difference is between box shadow and text shadow, and they take very similar values, by the way. So we can set 2 pixels, 2 pixels. Let's set cyan here. So we have a horizontal, a vertical, and a color. So you can see here, the shadow is actually on the text itself rather than surrounding the element, which we can see depicted by the border. But same kind of thing, we can actually make that shadow blurred with a blur radius. And we could actually think about combining all of these effects. So we could think about having a text shadow, but also a box shadow. We could also have an inset shadow as well, which can be used to create some interesting texture effects, by the way. Let's just return to box shadow. Let's take that inset effect. So we saw here it's used to create a sunken effect, but we can just use this to create some kind of textural effect on the button if we want to. So one way we can do this is just increase the size of the spread radius. That's probably too much for this color, but we can also boost that blur radius quite a bit. Let's set the color of the text to white. So you can see the color of that background is not smooth. It's not a continuous color. It's actually lighter in the middle at certain points. So we can create these various texture effects. We don't get that sunken effect anymore with this type of styling. Maybe the spread radius is a bit much in this case. Let's set that to 5 pixels. Let's turn that blur radius down as well. So here you can really get the idea of that textured effect. The white text no longer looks good here. Let's set it to black. But you can see we have a darker area around the edge of the button. We have a lighter area in the center of the button. So we get a nice texture effect. And if we want it to be completely centered, we can set the X and Y offsets to 0 pixels. So all we really need to do is find a color for the text that goes with that. Perhaps a dark blue or something. Let's take a look. Yeah, it looks okay. We could definitely use this as a heading on a site. You can maybe add the box shadow back in around the heading, and it's going to look okay. So key takeaways here are the values we can supply to box shadow. So we have inset, which we can either set or not set, depending on where we want the shadow. We have X offset, Y offset, blur radius, so the larger the value, the bigger the blur effect, and spread radius, which is the size of the shadow itself. Then we can provide any CSS color. we've seen how we can create 3D effects, sunken effects, but also textural effects. Finally, we've seen the difference between box shadow and text shadow. Thanks very much for watching, guys. Catch you in the next part of the course.